Welcome to all of you joining us for the African Forum on Green Economy, Investing in Natural Capital. We will be waiting just the obligatory minute for more people to join before we get started. So please sit tight. So welcome to those of you who are joining. We'll just wait a little bit longer for more people to join. We've got a lot of people signed up to this webinar. We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to take part. So you'll just hold on a moment. I know that Zoom did some updates over the weekend as well, so I know I've had a few difficulties getting in this morning myself. We'll just give people a little bit more time to be able to do the update. Or someone was saying to me this morning to have a negotiation with Zoom. Okay, let's get started now. I'll do a little bit of an introduction, then I'll hand over to a good friend of mine, Najma's, to be able to take this further. So you'll probably be aware that we had planned to run an event on the African Forum on Green Economy in Kampala, but due to circumstances that all of you will be very familiar with, we've had to change those plans. I hope that you are safe and well with your families and friends in these difficult times. This does offer us an opportunity, though, to still be able to engage with you and on a very important topic. And today, looking at infrastructure, really exciting to be able to get into this topic, which is driving change in so many places around the world. And particularly looking here at what Africa is going through and how Africa is resilient against this, and how natural capital and green economy are going to be the tools that are going to help us to deal with the infrastructure challenges that Africa is facing. The African Forum is a collaboration between lots of different partners. You can see some of the organizations up here, but there are many others as well that are taking a very active role at the moment in this agenda around what is a green economy and how does natural capital help us to achieve that. If we can move over to the next slide. So I'll just give you a little bit of background into what these terms that we're throwing around here, green economy and natural capital, actually mean. There's lots of different phrases that we use. And green economy is one which is supporting prosperity for everyone. But it's got to be within those ecological limits that we have, the thresholds, the limits of the planet. It allows natural systems, so that means the biodiversity, the water, the soils, the forests, and people to thrive together. And it's that nature and people together that is becoming so predominant in most of the international agendas and the local and national agendas, as we're seeing now, and particularly more important with COVID-19, and we're seeing the connections between people, nature, and the economy, and how all of these drive. So green economy is definitely essential now. It redistributes natural, physical, financial wealth, closing the gap, and that inequality gap is essential here. We've got to be addressing that. This isn't just about nature, it's about those inequality challenges that we face, and then brings those diverse voices into the policy making. And we'll get to that in a moment on natural capital as well. It's about the value to who. Who is this actually affecting? Has got to be at the core of this, not these ideas that come to us and are imposed upon us, but this is where natural capital and green economy really drive it through. It's about the people that it is affecting that have got to be at the core of this. So achieving this requires better measurement and governance, reform of financial systems, greening economic sectors, tackling inequality and valuing nature. And it's these things that are really going to drive the transformation that we need post-COVID in the world that we want to have leading up to the Sustainable Development Goals. If we can move over now, Hannah. So natural capital, the idea of capitals has been around since the 1970s, even actually before that, but has never really got a serious amount of traction. It's been used in different ways by different governments, by financial institutions and companies. But its time is really coming now. And the realization that actually we can start thinking of the world as a resource that we need to invest in. And I personally don't like being called a human capital. I'm sure no one else does here. But when we're actually making those decisions on a day-to-day basis, the idea of being able to think of things as something that is delivering benefits to us, nature is providing all of these services for us for free, and we're not paying for them. If we don't invest in them, those services stop. And we've seen that happen again and again. The clean water runs out, the air gets polluted if we don't invest in it. So thinking of it as a capital allows us to think about the stock that we've got to protect, invest in, the flow, the benefits that we get, and then the value again, the value to people that is being derived from these things. And if we think about it through this concept, as so many people are, and we are able to transform those ways of thinking so that we get down away from these big highfalutin ideas that are often promoted to us. We've got to have these big ideas and big programs. Very important to have those, but then we've got to make it real. Capitals is what makes this real in the day-to-day running. This takes this down to people on the ground being able to think about the resources that they want to invest in to be able to make sure they continue to get those benefits. If we can just move on to the next slide. So the forum, why are we here today? So the African Forum on Green Economy, investing in natural capital for a resilient Africa. What we're doing is we're promoting this understanding of the value of nature to Africa's economy. Everyone on this call will know about that value, but how can we make sure we're really driving that into the decisions? That's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to connect stakeholders. And so we're halfway through a whole series of events that we're running at the moment with stakeholders all across Africa and initiatives across Africa. So connecting those stakeholders together, because that's how we're going to get the change. Everyone I speak to thinks that they've got the solution and everyone else is the problem. That can't be the case. The actual answer to this is that we've all got parts of the solution and we've got to work together. So connecting those stakeholders is really important, which is why we then have got to commit to collaborative action. We've got to make sure that the green economy is going to help us to move low and middle income countries into a future that is going to be essential for everyone involved in that, and natural capital is at the core of that. So we're now going to pass over to Najma, who we've been working with very closely with the Green Economy Coalition, with WWF, with the Global Green Growth Knowledge Platform through Economics for Nature. And I'll hand over to you, Najma, to lead us through hopefully a very exciting webinar today. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone to the third webinar session of the African Forum on the Green Economy. So as Mark mentioned, I'm from the Green Economy Coalition, which is a global alliance of over 50 civil society organizations working together to accelerate the transition to a more green and inclusive economy. Given the centrality of infrastructure in Africa, this webinar will begin to explore how the much needed infrastructure on the continent can actually be delivered while putting people and nature at the center of infrastructure investments. Today is an opportunity to hear from the experts that we've invited to share their perspectives, but also to hear from you. And so we have an agenda where we will give an opportunity to our speakers to share their perspectives and also to you. So I think if you look on the slide, we will have 20 minutes to our presenters today. And if you have a look on your screen, you would see there's a very important aspect of this webinar, and that's the chats and Q&A section here, where we would invite you to post your responses. So if I could have the next slide, please. Any questions or comments, please use the Q&A and chat function. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible in the webinar. I would just advise you to please don't wait until the end. If there are any interesting points, questions that come up during the course of the presenters' inputs, please feel free to direct your question at one of the presenters or just to pose a question more generally on sustainable infrastructure. So I'd like to just put a little bit of background to our discussion around infrastructure. We have 4 panelists and I'm going to have an opportunity to introduce them in a short while. But I think the infrastructure deficits in Africa are well documented and well known. We know that around energy access, more than 600 million people on the continent don't have access to energy. If we look at the way internet access, has revolutionized society, we know that internet penetration in Africa is the lowest globally. Only a quarter of road networks in Africa is paved, making it incredibly difficult for communities in remote areas, to access the services that they need from urban centers. And Africa also has the highest proportion of slum dwellers in the world. So at the intersection of some of the major challenges that we're facing in Africa around urbanization, employment, economic growth, and our environmental challenges actually sits the question of infrastructure. So this is an incredibly important topic. I think those of us working in the continent also knows that in addition to the domestic sort of infrastructure investment thinking that's happening, infrastructure is a very important issue regionally. And the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, is a 30-year long strategy, a regional strategy to build regional infrastructure connectivity, to boost intra-Africa regional trade, which again is amongst the lowest in the world. Major infrastructure projects in Africa are expanding at an unprecedented pace. We've got some of the fastest growing economies in the world. But what does this infrastructure really mean for the lives and the well-being and the livelihoods of people in Africa? Is it really reaching into to touching the basic needs that people have? The limited existing infrastructure that we do have and we know needs to expand in Africa is already severely impacted by extreme events associated with climate change. And so there's an urgent need to ensure that climate resilience is integrated in the way infrastructure is designed and planned and delivered. And Lucy, I hope that you will alert us to this. We know that infrastructure investments, though needed, can have devastating impacts on communities and on natural systems. So how do we ensure that local communities are not only consulted and informed when infrastructure investments are coming into regions and localities, but that they become a part of the planning and design, and that infrastructure investments actually deliver, local benefits and improve and enhance well-being. And Oshani, we look forward to hearing from you, what are the type of tools available to actually help us to integrate, social and environmental issues into infrastructure planning and decision making, and to our third participant panelist joining us, Mr. John Madani. John, we hope that from the finance and the incredible experience that you've had in trying to structure major investments into infrastructure, how can we begin to finance the type of infrastructure that really delivers social, environmental, and economic benefits? So I will introduce all four our panelists. We are waiting for one more panelist, and I'm really hoping that he will be able to join us. If he doesn't, I think we have a more than enough rich conversation and expertise amongst our panelists to have a really great conversation on the topic today. So let me introduce the panelists, and then I will provide each of the panelists 5 minutes to really share their introductory perspectives on the topic, and then we try to open to all of you in the chat and in the Q&A section to pose your questions, and I encourage you to do that as the webinar goes along. So firstly, welcome to Oshani Pereira. Oshani, it's very good to have you with us. Oshani is the Director of Sustainable Infrastructure at the IISD. She advises policymakers on planning, procuring, and financing sustainable infrastructure and supporting innovative solutions that share risks between public and private counterparts. Oshani is the force behind the IISD's sustainable asset valuation tool, the SAVI tool, which I hope we'll hear about today. Welcome, Oshani. Joining us from the African Conservation Center, Lucy Waruingi. Lucy, welcome. Lucy's been working with the African Conservation Center for over 20 years and has been the Executive Director since 2012. Her experience spans the management and interpretation of biological and environmental data for decision-making, particularly to enhance local livelihoods in biodiversity-rich areas. Lucy is also a partner in the Collaborative Development Corridors Partnership, which encourages the input of science and stakeholder engagement into development planning. Welcome, and very happy to have you with us, Lucy. And finally, we have with us Mr. John Madani, who's the Finance and Commercial Director of Kenya Electricity Generating Company. John brings over 30 years experience in finance, transformation, strategy, and leadership. He's currently the Finance and ICT Director of KenGen, and he's overseeing, KenGen oversees 70% of the energy consumed in Kenya. Mr. Madani is currently actively involved in the development, financing, and execution of Vision 23 flagship energy projects, and holds a number of additional positions, including Director of the Africa Institute of Development Policy. Very happy to have you with us, John, and looking forward to your perspectives. But first, I'm happy to see that Desta Mebrato has just joined us, and while he's connecting to his audio, let me just give you a bit of background on Desta, and then hand over to Ushani. Desta is an extraordinary professor at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University. He's a chemical engineer by background and has more than 30 years of experience working for industries, universities, and international organizations, including 13 years at the UN Environment Programme. Recently, Desta has co-edited a number of publications, including a very interesting book that I would encourage you to lay your hands on if this is a topic that you're working on transformative infrastructure for development of a well-being economy in Africa. Desta, I'm really happy that you're able to join us for the first part of the webinar. We're going to be giving each of the panelists an opportunity to share their perspectives on sustainable infrastructure. And we'll be starting with Ushani. So Ushani, over to you to share your introductory perspectives on our topic.
Thank you, Najma. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me on this webinar. I would like to start by saying, let's not let this crisis go to waste. Let's not lose the opportunity that the crisis is giving us to re-examine why we need sustainable development and sustainable infrastructure. And in Africa, I've been following the debt forgiveness from the International Monetary Fund that is ongoing, and the increased lending and concessional lending that African countries are able to access because of the crisis. And the question I ask is, will these measures necessarily improve and increase public spending on infrastructure? When we look back at previous crises, we see that debt forgiveness has not necessarily meant that governments are spending more on infrastructure. And the question is, are they and can they spend on better and more sustainable infrastructure? Question mark. And can we use this momentum to make that change? And can we indeed work with our donors and work with our lenders to say, help us make lending linked to better performance on environmental areas, social areas, and government areas? So can we make lending a condition for better sustainability performance? Again, a question mark. Because you see, what's happening now is that the costs of climate change, the costs of biodiversity loss, and the costs of poor resilience are not factored into the net present value and the internal rate of return on infrastructure projects. So let me give you an example. John, you said to us at the beginning, before we got online, we have three major problems. We have droughts, we have floods, and we have locusts. The problem is, when we are building our assets, we are not going to count the costs of droughts into it. When we are building our eco-agriculture areas, the large agriculture eco-cities that we are trying to build, we're not going to factor in the costs of locusts and related damage. So this means that the fundamental internal rate of return and net present value on which we base our investments are wrong. If you're building a hydropower plant and we are not going to factor in the costs of erosion caused by large-scale flooding of forests, and we are not going to factor in how the loss of those forests will reduce rainfall, reduce the flow of water into a hydropower plant in the first place. We are working on internal rates of return which are wrong, and internal rates of return that don't tell us that we are building assets that are not going to be financially feasible in the medium term. And here is the fundamental problem. When you look at history, the costs of losses, the economic losses of nature are not built in. Nature has no place in our economic system. And that is the fundamental challenge I would like to put forward to us planning infrastructure. Let us begin to look 5 years into the future and say, we're living in a world that is easily 1.5 degrees hotter than it used to be. So when we build our oil-powered power plant, do we understand that that 1.5 degrees is going to make that asset financially infeasible in its first year of operation? Therefore, shouldn't we be looking at renewable solutions? If you're building hydro, and God knows we need the electricity, but we are building hydro at the expense of large-scale loss of forests, do we understand that loss of forest means no rainfall, meaning the hydropower plant is dead in the water, even as we are building it? We need to understand those costs. And in the technical video that you will see as a part of this series, I will present to you a systems thinking derived simulation methodology that is open to all. And it's fantastic to have Dexter on the call as a systems expert. We have developed a systemic methodology, a simulation methodology that helps us all understand the costs of environmental damage, of social incohesion and economic folly into infrastructure planning and plan our assets better. So these are the ideas I'd like to leave us with. Debt. Yeah, let us manage our debt. Does debt bring better spending for infrastructure? And what are the costs of inaction?
Thank you so much for those excellent points, Ushani. I'll hand over to Lucy to share her introductory perspectives on the topic. Lucy. If you unmute, if you can unmute. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you, Najma, and thank you for this opportunity. Already very interested in the perspectives that have been shared by Ushani. Very, very interesting, and really looking forward to that whole discussion on the tools that would help us build in these costs of nature and of biodiversity and ecological services into infrastructure projects. But in the 5 minutes, I would like to just give you a brief of how we are in the Development Corridors Partnership Project, aiming at getting a grasp at the different levels of this challenge. The one level is at the decision-making level of what is the motivation and what are the incentives or influences that determine what infrastructure project gets approved by government and how that process involves or does not involve other stakeholders. So in the Development Corridors project, we're looking at that component. We're also looking at the stakeholder engagement in that process, and not only of what you would call the direct economic beneficiaries, but stakeholders of people along that value chain. Some will be landowners, some will be peripheral communities alongside large linear infrastructure. Others will be potential stakeholders based on the vision that is cast by a country or a state, but where the articulation of what that benefit is not yet clearly integrated into the project design. So the Development Corridors Partnership also really looks at assessing the stakeholders along that process of both the decision-making for the infrastructure project and the planning and implementation of the same. Thirdly, we also look at the capacities that are there to determine if these infrastructure projects have taken on board the relevant components, and as rightly put by Mark at the beginning, the various value systems, be they natural, be they around biodiversity value chains, be they communities, and what their aspirations and expectations are. How do we use tools that are inclusive in how they're administered, inclusive in the scope of what they cover? And fourthly, we also look at the different policy frameworks and how does the outputs of our project influence at the higher policy level better decision making along infrastructure projects. And so the broader theme for us in the Development Corridors Partnership Program is to look at how we can design and implement sustainable, inclusive, and resilient development corridors for sustainable economic growth. So looking at how you build that resilience, inclusivity, sustainability, and economic growth along the design and implementation of development corridors. Our hope is that because the project includes 11 institutions drawn from Kenya, Tanzania, the UK, and China, and has over 40 researchers and several multiple streams of research projects, that will begin to get a better understanding of the four components that I have outlined just now, but also really have some clear outputs. We don't want this to be about an academic rigor that just identifies where the pinch points are and what's not working, but how do we, as we do the project, begin to influence these different points of enhancing our corridor planning and management. Also looking at the capacity. We realize when you look at the environmental impact assessments that are done and the strategic environmental assessments that are done for these mega projects, there are lots of gaps in integrating biodiversity values. And at a minimum, you see some of those addressed in the mitigation measures, but not in the design of the project itself from the onset. We are also looking at improving the capacity, therefore, for both researchers and planners in this area. Corridors can deliver sustainable development, but if the integration of the ecological integrity is not articulated at the beginning, then we definitely are sure we are going to undermine that ecological integrity. And so coming to really looking at natural capital as a broader framing that would help us to build in this resilience, our project is really hoping at building the understanding of the scale to which natural capital is integrated in the design of the development corridors, but also to map out the natural capital stocks and the assets that are found within these corridors. In the project in Kenya and Tanzania, we're looking at the big linear infrastructure like the SGR, the standard gauge railway from Mombasa to the Western Kenya. We're looking at the LAPSET, the multiple linear infrastructure that has oil and highway, oil pipelines and a highway and a railway from Lamu to the Lokicha area in Sudan and Ethiopia. And we are also wanting then to determine what are the dependencies of the natural capital stocks along this linear infrastructure and be able to identify the natural capital flows in these areas. I think the preliminary results that we are finding is that we expect to get shocks in the system because these key components are not included in the design. And for example, with the big flooding that's been happening, some of the flooding has been exacerbated by the actual design of the linear infrastructure that is in place. So, you know, worth it to belabor the point that the onset of the design of this infrastructure must embed within it the biodiversity stock, the biodiversity values, the ecological services provided, not just for nature, but also for people. And the elements of building resilience is also not just for nature, but also building resilience for the people who are expected to be the beneficiaries. So I'm expecting that in this discussion, we'll be able to share some of the key findings in the preliminary results that we have, but really have a deeper discussion on how do we do this? In Kenya, we have done two things that I would like to highlight in the remaining 1.5 minutes. We have had workshops that bring together the different sectors, because what's happening in East Africa, as I'm sure is happening world over, is that infrastructure is planned in the siloed sectoral ministries that are responsible for that infrastructure. But the impact of that infrastructure is not limited to that sector. So we have held 2 workshops inviting people across the different sectors, people from energy, people from the highways, people from the railways, the funding agencies, AFDB and the Chinese Exim Bank, the researchers, and more so the policymakers. And the summary of it has been, we need to engage across the sectors. This is not happening at the conceptual stage. It's not happening at the design stage. It's not happening at the planning stage. It's not happening at the implementation stage, but the impacts are felt once the projects are underway. So we must build back differently and build back better by beginning a multi-sectoral engagement earlier on. And finally, engaging the policymakers can also not be at the end of the project implementation. We've got to help the thinking through of the policy and ensure we can mainstream infrastructure, we can mainstream biodiversity concerns across the different sectors. On one hand, you can, yes, have a policy around biodiversity net values, but if that's not mainstreamed into agriculture, into irrigation strategies, into building strategies for infrastructure, into energy strategies, then again, we will have created a great policy in a silo. So those will be the remarks that we hope can give some insight into what we are hoping to have as direct impacts from our project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I think that was really a great example, and thank you for going into some of the concrete application. There's another webinar in the series coming on that will look into the question, of data. But I think, you've absolutely, hit it, spot on how scientists need to start interacting with policymakers, at various stages of the policy cycle, and not only when we're trying to fix, the impacts. Next, I'll hand over to John Madani to share his introductory perspectives on the topic that we're discussing today. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Najma. My name is John Madani. I'm the Finance and IC Director, as you did introduce me at the beginning. I work with KenGen, which stands for Kenya Electricity Generating Company. We are the main power generating company in Kenya, generating 70% of the power that's used in the country. And we are very, very much concerned about environment. Just to give a perspective, we have 92% of our installed capacity is actually green energy projects. And then as a nation, 90% are green energy projects, spanning different areas. For example, in just talking about how we are, 45% is hydro, almost 40% is geothermal, and 1.4% is wind, and we have some element of solar at national level. And that is really, really important for the country because of the significance we put to green energy. Now, how do we do it as KenGen? I must say that as we speak today, KenGen, I think, is maybe the only organization in Africa or in that is got 6 projects that are CDM registered projects. That's Clean Development Mechanism projects. We have earned close to $3 million as we from selling our CRs. That's carbon emission reduction units. As we speak today, we have 4.6 million CR units from our projects that we are looking for how we can sell them. And this is really an indication of what we do. So what we do is that in our projects from the word go, as we design the project, environmental management program is inbuilt in the project. This involves environmental social impact assessment. How will it be? How will it impact the environment? what mechanism do we need to put in place to correct if there are any things we need to do. Of course, we also get no objection from our financiers, and we keep monitoring. We invite NEMA, the National Environmental Management Program, to come and audit our projects at various stages, and they give us certificates. And every quarter, there's a review, an audit carried out on our projects in terms of how we are dealing with the issues of environmental management. Our projects are mainly out there. We work with Geothermal, which is in the Rift Valley, basically around Naivasha, for those who know Kenya, and that's really in the local community, the Great Volcanic Area. We also have hydro projects that are within the Tana Cascade and also in northern Kenya, and we have wind projects, and now we are venturing into some solar projects, and we must make sure that we keep. So we have got we have got environmental management officers and experts that are on the ground that work with the community, work with our staff, and work with our contractors. As you start a project in Kengen, part of the tender includes specifications on environmental requirements. We are ISO 14001 registered, certified, 9001. So all this must be met. The thing I will want to add is that Kengen and Kenya generally, in terms of energy generation, we work with the community very, very closely. One of the ways of working, and I'll give an example of our geothermal projects, we form what's called an ACC, this social consultative committee. And this is a tripartite committee which involves us as the project owners. It involves the community itself, and it involves also the governors, the representatives of government, particularly the regional commissioners. So this tripartite committee of stakeholders discuss and design as we move on with the stages from the word go. What are the things that need to be done? Because you find that because of power projects the way they are, sometimes it involves relocating people. It may affect people in terms of where they live. And one of the classic projects is that we had 3 streams, and these 3 streams are one stream is on employment, because as you get to work with the community, you must take care of how will they benefit from the project as a community. And our principle is based on the 3 Ps, the people, planet, and profit combined together. So we must have the local community engaged in terms of levels, depending on their skills. So they participate in terms of when we have an employment opportunity, who do they have from the community that can be engaged? We also have a wing on what you call the economic empowerment. Again, when you're in the area there, you'll find that there'll be business opportunities, and we engage the community if there are things to do with the transport, if there's some work to be done. We do not just take it outside, but we involve as much as possible the local community in those commercial opportunities, and they contribute. They are part of the committee because this is decided by the ACC. The ACC, which is the social consultative committee, they form 3 subcommittees. One looking after employment, another one looking after economic opportunities which arise from the project and the project area, and the other one is on environment. And I wanted to emphasize that there will be a committee that involves not only ourselves, but involves the government and involves the community in terms of how do we manage the environment, environmental issues, environmental concerns. How will the community help us to ensure that we sustain? For example, if we are doing rehabilitation of an environment, how do we ensure that the community will participate? If we are planting trees to conserve the environment, how do they get involved? And this is a continuous project as we move on with the project. We are focused mainly now in ensuring that the new projects that we do are green, and that's a priority. We are now doing what's called a geothermal-led strategy. And as you know, that geothermal is one of the renewable. We are now number 7 in the world in terms of geothermal production. and 40% of wind installed capacity is currently geothermal. We see that growing. Geothermal is actually what geo means earth and thermal is heat. So we drill down and get that out, and that's what we use for generation. And we are not having any more thermal projects on our pipeline. When it comes to funding, most of our projects are funded by the DFIs. They are funded by World Bank, JICA, the Japanese, KfW of Germany, EIB, European Investment Bank, and FD of France, and other commercial banks from Kenya. And part of the programming and the planning is that environmental issues are incorporated in the financial, in the design of the financial agreements. In fact, they have to certify and give us no objection at every stage as we move with the project to ensure that the project are compliant with the environmental standards. They are compliant. They meet the Equator principles, and they are not going to destroy the environment. They are going to leave the environment better, and also the people, to ensure that as we do our projects, we don't leave our people worse off. And I must say, in our last project, we had to relocate people. What we call resettlement. We had to come up with a resettlement action plan. This was a project funded by World Bank and EIB and KfW, and we had to build 150 new houses from Manyatas, houses made of mud. We had to build new 150 houses that meet certain standards. We had to build schools, new schools. We had to build new hospitals. So this is really how we engage in terms of ensuring that we work together with the community, and we also protect the environment.
Thank you very much, and sorry to interject you, but we would like to have one more perspective before we try to answer some of the questions. Thank you for the fantastic and very concrete examples that you shared around the type of regulatory systems, the safeguards and mechanisms that you put in place, and the concrete projects that you shared in the energy sector. Desta, I'd like to give you your the final word on this, your perspectives on sustainable infrastructure. And particularly the thoughts and ideas that you share in the book around how infrastructure can be transformational, how Africa has an opportunity, to leapfrog and not repeat the mistakes of resource and carbon intensive infrastructure investments. So I hand over to you, Desta, for your reflections on the topic that we're discussing.
Thank you very much, Najma. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. I would like to limit myself to 4 key points so that we could have time for some discussion, and I will build up on all what has been said, particularly the point mentioned by Oshani on the importance of having a systems perspective. The first point is, whenever we talk about infrastructure, the tendency and the orientation is always to jump on or focus on physical infrastructures. In our approach, we need to look at the ecological infrastructure, which is the foundation of every economic activity, the physical infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure, and the human infrastructure. These 4 components of the infrastructure are the key pillars of any development process. So unless we address these 4 pillars in a holistic and systemic perspective, every infrastructure development has got all these 4 dimensions. So the first point we have to focus on is to have this systemic perspective whenever we talk about infrastructure. Look at the dimensions, the various dimensions. The second point is, talking about physical infrastructure, most of the physical infrastructure we talk about will be with us for 20 to 50 years. They have long lifespan. And with that comes a huge locking potential. So whatever design consideration you take in the design, in the initial conceptualization, design, planning, development process, will act as a constraint factor for the coming 20 to 50 years. So considering the locking potential and trying to maximize the leapfrogging possibility, which we have a lot, is a critical element that has to be looked at, particularly when it comes to Africa. The third point is Africa, 70 to 75% of infrastructure we need to have in this region is yet to be built. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being pumped into infrastructure investment today. And this will continue for the coming decades. If we don't make the right investment decision today, Africa will be on the receiving end of most of the adverse consequences that we'll face related to climate impacts and various unsustainable outcomes you may have. So we have an opportunity here. Oshani earlier was talking about the debt relief issue. Where does it go? How is it going to be invested? I'm sure significant part of, if debt relief happens, significant part of that investment will be channeled to infrastructure. But what kind of infrastructure? For what purpose? How are we going to design that? How are we going to develop that? Keeping the broader sustainable development objectives in mind. Job creation, sustainable livelihood provision, women's empowerment. All these elements have to be brought into that process. So in order to do that, what we have tried to promote or reflect through our book on transformational infrastructure is we looked at the various sectors, the key sectors, industry, energy, urban infrastructure, and so on. And already African countries are making huge mistakes, ill-informed decisions on their infrastructural investment, which will be a cost for the region in the coming years. There are many examples on that. If you look at every infrastructure investment, you will find a number of cases where we have missed an opportunity. In order to overcome that, my last point is some of the earlier speakers have already alluded to on what needs to be done. What we are proposing is to promote and implement or practice a life cycle management for planning and development of infrastructure in Africa. The life cycle management approach captures all of the challenges that have been highlighted by Oshani, Lucy, and to some extent John, in terms of how are they going to be costed, what are the various elements, how is natural capital considered into that. So you start from the strategic level and go through by using different analytical and decision-making tools, you go to the operational level. And it provides that overall framework. And I think that will be something that African countries and development partners need to consider in the coming years. As a final piece of information, our book is, we are giving out our book free of charge. The e-book is available for African public and educational institutions free of charge. So I will send information to Najma and Hannah that could be shared to all participants. If you wish to have the e-version of the book, you can send us the form that needs to be completed and we will provide it to you. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all your reflections. They've been incredibly rich, and I did not feel it right to stop any of you, but I would like us to take some questions. We're going to go a little bit over time. I hope we can have all of you stay with us for at least another 10, 15 minutes for the most part, where we try to take some of the questions. I see some of the panelists have already been active on the Q&A, trying to answer some of them already, but perhaps let me just put a first question to Lucy and to Desta, and I have one in the back of my pocket for Oshana and John as well. But Desta and Lucy, a question has come up on the chat. And Lucy, I really liked, the kind of practical orientation that you gave in your introduction, where you spoke about the importance of integrating, the best scientific evidence and advice that we have on hand to make really good decisions. Desta, you spoke about we are not short, unfortunately, of finding cases and examples of really poor decision making happening at the moment with all of this knowledge at our knowledge and understanding and information and at our disposal. And I really want to pick up on a point that you raised, and ask both of you to reflect on the challenges of trying to implement, more systemic kind of decision making. We know, I mean, that often, the environment ministries within countries have the responsibility for doing, the environment and social safeguards and the checks on investments. But how do we begin to have our economic, finance, treasury, planning ministries, understand that this is not a checkbox exercise. It's not a tick on a page, or part in the process that we've done, and we carry on. And then, as you said, Lucy, we deal with with this at the impact level when we see that this didn't really go as planned. How can we really try to push forward, much more systemic and integrated way of doing infrastructure planning? And Lucy, I'll hand over to you to perhaps respond first while Desta formulates and thinks about his response.
Okay, thank you, Najma. I'll give an initial response and would be happy to hear what others would think on the same. Two things come to mind. One is that as we have engaged with the different sectors, we have found that the technical engineers across all these sectors, or the technical directors in the different ministries, really would like to interface and integrate more. But the way they're structured within their mandate, and you know how government is, if you don't have a structure that enables you to collaborate across ministries, then you have no role to go out to the other ministry and ask them to come into your meeting as you design what you're designing. So we found that there's willingness at a senior management level, but there isn't a guidance in policy on how that can be. And so one of the things we've now proposed is to really start with a round table with the highest officers, which would be the cabinet secretaries, to across all these sectors and really have this as a conversation and a dialogue. To say because everyone you speak to knows the challenge, but all of them only know what to do within their docket. They'll do the tick boxes, but they don't know how to cross-engage. So we think this will have to be a learning by doing. And if we can meet in one room and have a dialogue with them and say, what platform will work for you to enable these cross-sectoral discussions to happen? So far, they're all willing in principle to have that dialogue. So I think my take is we need to be a bit bolder and provide solutions to them and then offer to midwife those solutions that get them to a point where they can then determine the framework that works. But number two, in terms of engaging the planning sectors and finance sectors, it's become very clear to us that we speak our own jargon that only we understand. So even though we write what we call a policy brief or what we think is a recommendation document, they don't get it. And so we're upset with them because we've done all this research and we've put it out on papers. And in the Development Corridors Partnership, we're actually currently going through a training on how do you practically translate what you're doing into documents that can be used by this target audience. So I think we have had to admit that we are not packaging our information in a way that they can use. So there's a bit more work for us to do. And I think a bit of that requires some building of capacity to do so effectively.
Thank you so much for your reflections, Lucy. Desta, your thoughts on just how do we get this in reality going?
Yeah, well, I will focus on two critical points. Number one, to overcome the current challenge and make a meaningful progress on where we want to be, there has to be a transition on the planning regimes. The planning regime has to move from the conventional planning regime, which is largely expert-based, which is largely silo-oriented, which is largely top-down, has to move towards discursive planning, which is more dynamic, which is more cross-sectoral, which is more top-down and bottom-up. This is the kind of planning transition we need to have. Without that, sustainable development will just be a talk. I mean, it wouldn't happen. And there are various elements already in place to make this happen, the discursive planning process. There are hundreds of initiatives around the world which are following this way of planning process. So this dynamic transition in the planning regime has to happen, which will help us the engineers to work with sociologists, economists, community workers, and society. So everything, all these elements need to come together. Related to this, the second important point which needs to be taken, I mean, the first one is more of, it requires change of thinking and attitude in the expert regime and so on. But the second one, which is critical, which is a major source of problem for most African countries, is the challenge of breaking the institutional silos. Most of the problems are coming from this silo-oriented approach, even within one country, even within one ministry, even within one agency. There is a significant entrenched mentality of silo orientation. This institutional silo has to be broken. These two elements, if we are able to achieve some level of transition on these two levels, I think we'll make some headway towards the desired outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for your inputs. I think I'm left with some hope after both your suggestions on, the different types of planning, breaking the institutional silos. I think we have leadership on this call today that's exactly willing, to break, these institutional barriers between us. John, I cannot let you go without asking you for, your one key reflection, and looking at your bio when I was, introducing you, you've got this incredible experience in, in financing. We know that a lot of the finance for infrastructure is coming from the public sector. I would like to ask you perhaps to just your one key point that you would like to make on how we can begin to bring in more, private sector finance into addressing, the infrastructure financing gap in Africa. John, your one big recommendation that you would put forward to get the private sector on board.
Oh, thank you so much, Najma. Of course, private sector, two things. One, guarantee there's some returns and security of their investment is very important. And then helping them to mitigate risks, whether it's political risk, whether it's all those risks. So they are there in business, they come to make money. So guaranteeing them some minimum basic return. And of course, we know that particularly in some of the infrastructure, the governments are also concerned about the social cost of this, but also mitigate the risks by government, for example, providing guarantees or some support, some letter of support, and just guaranteeing the legal environment and political environment to bring certainty and minimize risks. I think that would be good for them.
Thank you, John, for sharing those very concrete inputs and for the incredible example that you gave of the work of KenGen. Oshani, your final thoughts. I know we haven't had much time to go into the SAVI tool, but I think we can also tell all the participants that we're going to be sharing lots of materials on the topic. And I do think that coming up, we've got webinars on data, on finance, that will definitely explore some of the key points that you've raised. But Oshani, perhaps if you could let us end on a bit of a hopeful note as to how we can begin to access concrete tools to begin to deliver infrastructure that works, for people and also safeguard the natural capital that's so essential for the continent's well-being.
Najma, I wish I could give you hope. Okay.
Please.
I just wish.
No pressure.
Let me just say, let's not waste a good crisis. Okay, let's not waste it. And for hope, let me be slightly provocative and say, when we look at infrastructure, do we always have to look at a built solution? So without saying, what shall we build, can we turn the question around and ask, what do we need? What do we need in terms of public services? And can we first look around at nature and see, can nature deliver that public service without us having to always build one? Water crisis in Africa is looming. Let me rephrase, the water crisis in Africa is here. That is the number one risk that frightens me about Africa. Where are we going to find the water? And for that, let us not say, where do we get water supply from? How many desalination plants are we going to build? but instead say, can we protect our forests and our wetlands to make sure that we have water in the first place? So let us go back and ask this very important question on, can nature deliver, and what nature cannot deliver? Let us see how we can build in a most sustainable way. Let us not waste a good crisis to ask the right question.
Thank you, Shani. I think that's hope enough for me. I feel like we've just skimmed, the surface, but thank you for the incredible insights from the panelists. The questions that have come in, many of whom have been answered. We try to look at them afterwards. I'd like to just say thank you to all the panelists. I've connected with some old friends, and I hope made some new. It's been a really good conversation to learn from all of you and to take inspiration to carry this important topic forward in our work. So thank you all for joining us, and to everyone that's joined us for this webinar. I'll hand over to Mark now. Any final reflections, Mark, and also to share with us details of the next webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Najma, and some really interesting conversations there. I've actually started thinking about what the next big activity we should be looking at. I think it should be infrastructure, and I think Africa is the place that we really need to base this from. Don't forget, please, that if you are involved in this webinar series, you can find out more about the speakers all on the website. They'll be sharing their detailed presentations and other things that they've been doing throughout their careers. All of that we can access through the website, so please come through to that. And we'll be continuing this conversation over the next week. So if you haven't been able to ask your question now, if you've got more questions, there are other ways of doing that. Go to the African Forum on Green Economy website, and you'll be able to find out more information there. Next week, we've got finance, and some really interesting conversations going on there about how do we finance the changes that we want. We touched on some of that today, which has been great. Then we're also going to be looking at data, and then we're going to be closing this all off looking at change. So 3 more webinars to come. Please do come back in. I know there's been a few problems. I've had a few texts this morning, people getting onto Zoom. We'll solve all of that by next time these technical things are there to challenge us. We'll get that one solved. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Thank you once again to the speakers and to Najma, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.